Thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak at an NDN conference. I think the group and what you're doing is just fantastic in terms of really visionary ideas that Rob and his colleague Mike Moynihan has just done a superb paper on the very topic I'm talking about. And Rob's work is just so visionary about the economy. And of course, Simon has just exercised enormous leadership in our party and in our country. So it's just a group that's, for me, a privilege to be a part of. And I'd like to take off on a point that Rob underscored about infrastructure. That's my assigned topic. I won't take a lot of time because infrastructure is a relatively well-discussed, thoroughly discussed topic over the last several months. And I think that's very good. So I'll just tick off a few of the reasons I think that infrastructure, public infrastructure's time has come, because the needs are so acute and so apparent and so obvious, I think, to most Americans. And I'll just touch a few of them. One is growth, economic growth. Rob made this point. Giving money to people, rebate checks that they spend, that helps for a period of time. But strong, sustained growth requires projects that last longer than 2 months or 4 months or 6 months. Infrastructure projects take years and years if you fund them properly. Not each project, but the series of projects can help to sustain growth over a very long period of time, and second, create a great many jobs. But even more important than that, they deal with some of the other issues that Rob touched on. Energy. We waste an enormous amount of energy in this country with traffic jams and congestion in ports and things of that nature. We could dramatically reduce energy use in this country if we had more efficient infrastructure. The light rail transport system, for instance, in Denver is a very good example of that. A lot of people don't have to drive because they can take that light rail train. And as a result, also, it helps on the environmental side. The less time in traffic congestion, the more public transportation, the better we are in dealing with the environment issues. And then there are the national security issues. Not just security against terrorism, and that is protecting our infrastructure against terrorism, but we've seen bridges fall down, we've seen the levees in New Orleans collapse. That is a national security issue. The people who died when that bridge fell down in Minneapolis were killed the same way as if it had been a terrorist attack blowing up that bridge. So we really need to look at this from the point of view of all these things coming together, and the needs in this country are acute, and we have not dealt with them. We've postponed them for 20, 25 years. The second point is, how do we deal with this? How do we fund these various requirements? And here's a time for a reality check. It cannot be only federal taxpayers who do this. If you look at the Highway Trust Fund, which is a user fee fund, it is running out of money because it is a fixed amount of money. Even as taxes go up in other areas, that tax has stayed the same because it's so unpopular, no one wants to raise that tax. But the fact is, we want better infrastructure, we want more infrastructure, we want cleaner infrastructure. We're going to have to find ways of paying for it. The era of a free lunch is over, and we've got to deal with this in general. We have a $500 billion deficit. And getting the money that we need just out of taxpayers' money or just out of a tax that goes into the Highway Trust Fund, I think is going to be very difficult to do. Everyone is going to be competing with, for tax dollars. The Barack Obama administration is committed to reducing the deficit, not increasing it. It's going to be much harder to fund these programs out of taxes. So what do? There are ways of addressing this. There are some very new techniques that have been developed. And let me use Denver as an example. The light rail transportation system here was a public-private partnership. There are many areas where you can get private sector companies to come in, make investments in these projects, utilize money, equity money that's raised in the market or bond money that's raised in the market. This is not the only way. There still needs to be government programs financed by the federal government, financed by the municipalities. But there are ways of doing it where you get the private sector more actively involved. So private sector money is at risk, and it tends to be the case that the private sector gets these things accomplished more quickly than the government sector, as in a number of other areas. And then there's this program that's very positive and I think well tested in terms of the idea, and that is the Dodd-Hagel bill, which creates an infrastructure development bank, which this bank in itself can take a certain amount of government money, sort of startup money, and then borrow additional money from the market to finance good projects. And I emphasize good for one simple reason, and that is the American public is no longer going to put up with huge amounts of money being spent for infrastructure that is based on effectively pork barrel politics. Bridges to nowhere, that's just one example. There are many examples in the budget where infrastructure money is allocated not because of need, not because of efficiency of the project, but because a certain politician in one district has more power than a certain politician in another district. And we simply cannot go forward on that basis. First of all, it distorts the use of taxpayers' money. And second, it undermines confidence in our governmental system. And that is one point that I think is terribly important in our country today. It's not just that people, as Rob's correctly pointed out, have lost confidence in our leadership. They're beginning to lose confidence in the question of whether the government can actually deliver on the kinds of things it's supposed to deliver on, because this administration has undermined confidence in the government, suggested that government really can't do these things, and if you don't really believe in the effectiveness of government, you're not going to run the government very well. And that's what we've seen over the last few years. So we have to restore confidence in the institutions of government, and that means taking the money that is appropriated and making sure that it is used efficiently, effectively, where the need is, not on the basis of who is the most influential congressman or who heads the committee that has jurisdiction over these various things. And that brings me to the final point, and we'll have time, I hope, for questions and answers, and that is the transparency of the process. There are a number of people who are skeptical of public-private partnerships because they say if you give it to the private sector, there will be insufficient accountability. And I think there is a risk of that. And therefore, those municipalities and states that have created these public-private partnerships, in the state of Pennsylvania, Governor Randell has been really a great leader in this, has made very sure that where these things exist, there are very clear lines of delineation as to the role of the private sector, so it can't abuse the process by raising tolls in an unlimited way, and making sure, the other thing is to make sure that the money that is collected from the states when they lease these things out or allow the private sector to run them, that money is used for productive purposes, not that the money does not go into eliminating or reducing the federal or the state deficit. And that's another part of the problem. If you get toll money from a highway, the additional money should go back into more infrastructure and better infrastructure, not using the highway toll system in a given state to subsidize other parts of the budget. If it's money collected for infrastructure, it should go into other parts of infrastructure. So this is a very important part. And infrastructure is not just highways or dams or bridges. It's, as Rob pointed out, the infrastructure also involves the internet, also involves wideband transmission technology. Because infrastructure is not just about moving physical things, as important as that is, it's about moving information. And the last point I'd leave with you is, think about this. We're increasingly faced with the kind of competition Rob's indicated from around the world, China, India, many parts of the world. The one thing you notice when you get off the airport, off the plane in Beijing, coming from John F. Kennedy Airport or any other major airport in this country, you wonder who the developing country is and who the developed country is. You look at these modern airports, look at the Olympics and China's infrastructure there. These countries are building efficient highway systems, they're building efficient wideband systems so that people can communicate using the internet, they're building efficient bridges all around the world. If we're going to compete, if our companies are going to be able to compete, they're going to need the best infrastructure for moving information and the best infrastructure for moving goods around this country and exporting them. That is going to be very important. So if you watch TV, people blame China for our problems. Chinese are too competitive, the Indians are too competitive, the Brazilians are too competitive. One of the biggest problems we have in this country is we're fighting this competitive battle with one hand tied behind our back. If we don't have a much more efficient, much more modern infrastructure, it creates jobs, it deals with the environmental issue, it deals with the energy issue, and it deals with the competitiveness issue. And we're going to have to face up to the fact we have not done enough over the last 20 years. Needs are building up. a couple of $1 trillion is going to be needed over the next 10 years, and we've got to figure out ways of doing it that don't necessarily involve the taxpayer putting up all the money, because if you rely on that, it won't happen. We have to find very creative ways of financing it. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. Question.
Hi, I'm Len Simon from San Diego, and you sort of anticipated my question but didn't give an answer. We have lots of infrastructure needs all over San Diego and California, lots of politicians who won't raise taxes, and they're plenty intelligent enough to see what the problems are, and they're cautious enough to commit not to raise taxes or to decide not to raise taxes later. So what are the creative solutions? What's out there to get out of this box of what we need and what we don't want to spend?
Well, there are several ways, because you're right. Raising the tax, the gasoline tax, is simply a non-starter in the Congress. You talk to anyone, even people deeply committed to these kinds of programs, they say it will not fly, otherwise they won't get reelected. They're not going to vote for it. But there are other ways of doing it. One is congestion pricing. Mayor Bloomberg tried this in New York. It got defeated by legislators, but it makes a lot of sense. Many other cities have done it. It is very effective. If you want to move your car into a city in the middle of the day, you pay a higher rate or a surtax of some sort. It's easily done because of these, we call in New York easy passes. You can computerize it and figure out who's going into the city, and they get a bill at the end of the month. That does two things. It reduces congestion and it adds to revenues. A second thing you can do are user fees, in other words, tolls. There are a lot of ways of collecting tolls. You don't necessarily have to stick the money in a toll booth. It can be based on peak hour movement of your car, things of that nature that can actually increase revenues for the transportation system. Now, I'm aware that one of the problems here is that lower income people who have to work find this a big burden. It is very regressive to people who have to work, who have a pickup truck and have to go 30 miles, let's say in Southern California, to get to work. So you have to do two things. Even as you're raising tolls or user fees or things like that, make sure there's good public transportation alternatives to the extent you can do that, so lower income people can find other ways of getting there without having to pay these additional tolls. But the fact is, there are not a lot of options. Either you raise the user fee for these kinds of things, or you're not going to have money to build out the infrastructure in as robust a way as we need. And the last point is, in terms of financing, as I said, you don't necessarily need the federal government to do it, although that does play a role. States, through municipal bonds, play a role, but also finding ways through, for instance, this infrastructure development bank to raise capital through bonds that are, in effect, partially guaranteed by the federal government. There are a lot of pension funds in this country, all around the country, that would like to invest more in infrastructure. But pension funds don't pay taxes, so they don't buy municipal bonds because they don't need the advantage, the benefit of a tax-free bond. And then there's a lot of foreign money in all these sovereign wealth funds, but in other institutions as well that are not sovereign wealth funds. They're looking around the world to invest in this kind of technology and these sorts of programs. But again, tax-free bonds don't help them since they don't pay federal taxes in the United States. So finding ways of mobilizing these new pools of capital from around the world and making sure that under the right conditions, which means good supervision, total transparency, we can draw on that capital to build out our infrastructure here makes a lot of sense. But you've got to find some way, if you're going to get more money through this bank or through foreign capital, someone is going to have to pay for it. If it's not the taxpayer, it's going to have to be the user in one way or another. Otherwise, we simply won't have the infrastructure we need. It is not a free lunch here.
Another question. Alternate side.
I'd like to address competitiveness. You talked about the difference between Kennedy and Beijing Airport, and I have spent some time in China, and about the Olympics and about the communications in China. How is a free market economy supposed to compete with an economy where they say, don't worry about having a cell tower in your backyard because it's not your backyard anymore, it's ours. And don't worry about, we can make anything happen because we control everything. How do you compete on a fair, foot-to-foot, level playing field basis?
Well, You know, it is a challenge because some of these countries can do things that we can't do. They've found more money for infrastructure, and they can build roads. They just tell people, you're going to move, and we're going to build this road here. They do that. And we can't do that. We have eminent domain. It takes years if you want to do it at all, and then many of these things get hung up and never happen. We've chosen the kind of society we want. That's not the kind of society we want where the government can simply say things are done. It means we have to rise to another level of competitiveness. It means we have to, and Rob has made this point, and he has a superb book out, which I hope all of you will read, which describes a lot of these things, but so I'll paraphrase it. But one of the points he made here, and I've tried to make the same point, is we've got to invest in the new jobs that are knowledge-driven jobs to create new kinds of products and new opportunities for the American worker. And one of the areas, for instance, the internet. 20 years ago, who would have thought you'd get a lot of jobs in the internet? The internet now produces jobs not just in making things for the internet, but the ability to move information around has created huge numbers of new jobs. In the area of energy, we have an opportunity to create, point Hillary Clinton made last night and Barack Obama has made, that is to create a lot of green jobs by producing the best technology for utilizing energy more efficiently. Let me make one point about that, and that is in the 1990s and up until recently, a lot of workers invested in ways, a lot of companies invested in ways of utilizing their workers more productively and the productivity of the workforce. Over the next 20 years, the big new investments are going to be how do you increase the productivity of the use of raw materials, particularly oil and natural gas, for two reasons. One, because they're expensive, and two, because the more efficiently we utilize oil, gas, and other raw materials, the better the impact will be on the environment. It's environmentally friendly as well. Now, in building the towers, your question's a perfectly good one. We're just going to have to realize that if we want energy, if we want efficiency, people are going to have to make some sacrifices. And we've polarized the debate about energy in this country. There are some people who don't want any drilling anywhere, anytime. They think it can all be done with alternative sources of energy. Well, maybe in the very long run it can be, but in the near term, unfortunately, if we don't utilize at least some traditional sources of energy, nuclear and some offshore drilling, we're going to be more dependent on these countries, many of whom don't really mean us very well. There's another group that would drill anywhere at any time. They would drill in the middle of Central Park if they thought there was oil. So, what? Right. But so that's part of the problem, to find that balance and to figure out how we do these things in a democratic system where people make trade-offs, where people bargain. And I think one of the strengths that President Obama would bring is he wants to bring the conservatives and the liberals on this issue together. And there's this group of 10 that's already in the Congress that's trying to reach these deals. So I think there are ways, short of drilling everywhere and short of drilling nowhere, that we can figure out some kind of solution to deal with this. And improving the infrastructure is one part, because getting oil is one thing, using it more efficiently is very important. To the extent you use energy more efficiently, you don't have to do as much drilling or you don't have to import as much oil. And we've got to blend our environmental policy, our energy policy, and our infrastructure together if we want a sensible long-term policy. It means tough choices. That's what it means.
Every society makes these trade-offs. And in China, the trade-off is, one trade-off is the trade-off Bob mentioned, which is we'll build this infrastructure, and by the way, you have no freedom.
Yeah.
You have no ability to use any political process to modify the plans of 4 people who sit at the top of the Politburo in Beijing. The other trade-off they made is they unraveled a universal health care system and a universal pension system in order to channel all those funds into economic modernization, so that over 80% of Chinese have no health care coverage. And in China, if you're injured outside the biggest hospital in Beijing and you're not one of the 20% with coverage or cannot pay on the spot, they put you on the sidewalk. You die. The system is called pay or die. So China is making very difficult trade-offs, that is, trade-offs that are very difficult for their people, where we have the ingenuity to come up with a whole series of new approaches to make those trade-offs as low cost as possible for as many people as possible, led by thinkers in business and outside business like Bob Hormats.
Yeah, and we had an opportunity to make these trade-offs. Normally, we're very good at making these trade-offs in a crisis situation. That's when this country rises to the occasion. After 9/11, there would have been an opportune moment for the president to say, we need a national energy policy, and everyone is going to have to give something to do this. The people are going to all have to make a certain sacrifice to have a national energy policy so we don't become even more dependent on oil from the Middle East. When Carter said reducing oil dependence is the moral equivalent of war, we were 30% dependent on imported oil. Now we're 70% dependent. And it comes from these 15 countries who are whose oil is held by national oil companies. And you know, we spent a lot of time in Congress criticizing the majors, but the majors control so little of this oil. That is really the center of the problem, is not in the majors in this country, it is in all these other countries, and the more dependent we are, the more powerful they are, the more leverage they have over us, and the higher the price is going to be over the long term. Until we figure this out and make it a national priority, we're going to become even more dependent. And a national priority means making the kind of trade-offs so that we reduce dependence now and reduce dependence in the long term. Otherwise, it's a national security issue, and it's ripping $700 million a year out of the pockets of American taxpayers and putting them into other countries. That's a big problem. Thank you very much.